I never thought the worst day of my life would actually become the turning point of my entire existence. But when I opened my eyes and found myself lying under the CEO's desk, staring directly at a pair of expensive Italian leather shoes, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might actually explode right there. This was it. This was how my career would end before it even began. "What exactly are you doing down there?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was something in it that I couldn't quite place. Concern? Confusion? Anger waiting to surface? I jerked upwards so fast that my head slammed against the underside of the mahogany desk. Stars exploded behind my eyes as reality came crashing down. This was Brock Wyatt, 28 years old, CEO of one of the fastest growing tech companies in the country, the man who'd graced the cover of Forbes twice, whose single glance could make entire departments go silent. And me? I was nobody, just an intern who'd joined exactly 24 hours ago. "I'm so sorry, sir." The words tumbled out as I scrambled to get out from under his desk, my folder slipping from my hands and scattering papers across his pristine office floor. I was finishing the project until 2 in the morning, and then I came here because the air conditioning was working and my cubicle was like a furnace and I could barely breathe, and I stopped myself before I could ramble more, my face burning with embarrassment and panic. Brock stared at me with those intense gray eyes that seemed to see right through every excuse, every desperate explanation. I waited for the explosion, for him to call security, for the humiliation of being escorted out of the building in front of everyone. But he didn't yell. He just stood there studying me with an expression I couldn't read. "Do you have any idea how this looks?" he finally said. "If security had found you here instead of me, you'd already be terminated. This is my private office." I hung my head, wishing the floor would just swallow me whole. "I know. I'm really sorry. I'll leave right now." My hands shook as I bent down to gather the scattered papers, my cheeks still burning hot. I could feel his eyes on me, watching every clumsy movement. When I had everything clutched against my chest, I turned toward the door, ready to run and never look back. But then his hand wrapped around my wrist. Not rough, not aggressive, just firm. Steady. I froze. "Wait." That single word stopped my entire world. "What project were you working on until 2 in the morning?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his eyes. "Summit Analytics. The client pitch deck. The marketing team said they needed it by this morning." Something flickered across his face, something sharp and dangerous. "That presentation isn't scheduled for another week and a half. Why would they make you complete it overnight?" My silence was answer enough. I saw understanding dawn in his expression, followed by something that looked almost like anger but not directed at me. He released my wrist and took a step back, his jaw tight. "Go to your desk. Get some rest. Then I want you back here at 10 o'clock sharp. We need to talk." His tone left no room for argument. I could only manage a nod before I practically fled from his office. My heart still racing, but now for completely different reasons. As I walked through the empty early morning corridors, I kept replaying that moment when he'd grabbed my wrist, when concern had flickered in his eyes, when his anger hadn't been aimed at me but for me. It didn't make sense. CEOs didn't care about interns. They especially didn't care about interns who fell asleep under their desks. So why did Brock Wyatt look at me like he actually gave a damn? I reached my cubicle and collapsed into my chair, my mind spinning. The sunrise was just beginning to paint the sky outside the windows, casting long shadows across the empty office floor. I should have been thinking about getting fired, about how to explain this disaster to my parents, about my ruined career before it even started. Instead, all I could think about was the weight of his hand on my wrist, the intensity in his eyes, the way he'd said we need to talk like I was someone who actually mattered. I pulled out my phone and stared at the time. 7:45. I had a little over 2 hours before I had to face him again. 2 hours to figure out what the hell had just happened and why my heart was still pounding like I'd run a marathon. 2 hours to convince myself that the weird flutter in my chest meant nothing, that I was just stressed and exhausted and reading way too much into a simple interaction. But deep down, I knew something had shifted in that office. When Brock had looked at me, really looked at me, I'd felt seen in a way I'd never experienced before. Not as an intern, not as some forgettable entry-level employee, but as a person. as someone worth noticing. I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair, trying to calm my breathing. This was insane. I was being absolutely ridiculous. He was my boss's boss's boss. He was a CEO. I was literally the lowest person on the company hierarchy. There was no universe in which this ended well for me. But then I remembered the way his fingers had felt around my wrist. Warm and solid and real. The way his voice had softened when he'd told me to rest. The way he'd immediately understood what the marketing team had done to me. And the protective anger that had flashed across his face. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe I was just desperate for someone to care after feeling so alone and overwhelmed on my first day. Maybe this was just exhaustion playing tricks on my mind, making me imagine things that weren't there. Or maybe, just maybe, something had started in that moment. Something neither of us had expected or planned for. Something that would either destroy my career or change my life forever. I opened my eyes and looked at my reflection in the dark computer screen. I looked terrible, disheveled and tired, with dark circles under my eyes and my hair sticking up at odd angles. This was who the CEO of a billion-dollar company had found sleeping under his desk. This was who he'd looked at with something that almost resembled concern. 10 o'clock. I had to be back in his office at 10 o'clock sharp, and I had absolutely no idea what he was going to say, what he was going to do, or how my life was about to change. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. The sun continued to rise outside, painting the office in shades of gold and pink, and I sat there in my cubicle, my wrists still tingling from where he'd touched me, counting down the minutes until I had to face Brock Wyatt again. 10 o'clock arrived faster than I wanted it to. I stood outside Brock's office holding a coffee cup like a shield, my other hand clutching the cleaned-up version of my presentation. His assistant glanced up at me, then at her computer screen, then nodded toward the door with a small smile that did nothing to calm my nerves. I knocked twice, my knuckles barely making a sound against the heavy wood. Enter. His voice came through clear and commanding. I pushed open the door and stepped into what felt like an entirely different dimension. The morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a space that somehow managed to be both intimidating and beautiful. The entire city sprawled below us like a living map, people and cars reduced to tiny moving dots. And there, behind that massive desk, sat Brock Wyatt, but not the Brock Wyatt I'd expected. His suit jacket hung on a nearby chair, his sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and he looked less like an untouchable CEO and more like an actual human being who happened to run a company. "Sit down, Levi." He gestured to the chair across from him. I froze halfway to the chair. "You know my name? I make it a point to know everyone who works for me." He leaned back slightly, his gray eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin feel too tight, especially those who break into my office to take unauthorized naps. Heat flooded my face. "I really am sorry about—" "Stop." He held up one hand. "I'm not interested in more apologies. I want to understand what happened. Walk me through your first day here. All of it." So I did. I told him about arriving excited and nervous, about being immediately handed off to the marketing team, about the senior associate who dumped 3 different projects on my desk with conflicting deadlines. I explained how every question I'd asked had been met with sighs and eye rolls, how I'd been told that we all started somewhere and that paying your dues is part of the process. I described working through lunch, staying late while everyone else left, the growing realization that my cubicle's air conditioning had been broken for weeks and nobody had bothered to report it because interns don't need to be comfortable. Brock's expression grew darker with every sentence. When I mentioned finishing the presentation at 2 in the morning and desperately seeking somewhere cool to sit for just a moment, his jaw clenched visibly. "And you thought sleeping under my desk was your best option?" There was no mockery in his voice, just genuine curiosity mixed with something that sounded like barely contained fury. "I didn't plan to fall asleep," I admitted quietly. "I just wanted to cool down for a few minutes in a space that had working climate control." The next thing I knew, you were standing there. He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming once against his desk. Then he reached into a drawer and pulled out a tablet, swiping through screens until he found what he wanted. He turned it around to face me. It showed an organizational chart, and as I watched, he tapped several names, marking them with red dots. "These people will be spoken to today. The broken air conditioning will be fixed by noon. And you, he paused, his eyes locking onto mine with such intensity that I forgot how to breathe. You're being reassigned effective immediately. You'll work directly under my department, reporting to my senior team lead. You'll have real projects, proper training, and reasonable hours. Nobody gets to treat talent like disposable labor. Not in my company. I stared at him, unable to process what I was hearing. Sir, I'm just an intern. I've been here one day. You produced a presentation in 6 hours that most of my junior associates couldn't complete in 3 days. I reviewed it this morning. He slid a printed copy across the desk and I saw his handwriting covering the margins. Not corrections. Notes, suggestions, improvements that showed he'd actually read every single slide. You have potential. I don't waste potential, and I don't tolerate people who exploit those beneath them in the hierarchy. My throat felt tight. Why are you doing this? The question slipped out before I could stop it, and I immediately wished I could take it back. You didn't question the CEO. You said thank you and left before he changed his mind. But Brock didn't look angry. If anything, his expression softened slightly. Do you want an honest answer? I nodded, not trusting my voice. When I found you this morning, my first thought was to call security. My second thought was to fire whoever was responsible for you being in that position. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to me now. Then I saw your face. You looked terrified and exhausted and so young. And I realized you reminded me of myself 10 years ago. Nobody helped me when I was drowning. Nobody noticed when I was being taken advantage of. I had to claw my way up alone. And it almost broke me. He turned back to face me. I swore that if I ever had the power to change that for someone else, I would. So that's what I'm doing. Consider it paying forward a kindness I never received. The silence that followed felt heavy with meaning. I didn't quite understand yet. There was something in the way he looked at me, something beyond professional concern or corporate responsibility, but I was too overwhelmed to examine it closely. Thank you, I managed finally. I won't let you down. I know you won't. He returned to his desk and pulled out a folder with my name already printed on the tab. Report to Jennifer Hayes on the 15th floor starting Monday. She'll be your direct supervisor. Take the rest of today off. Go home, actually sleep in a bed instead of under furniture. Come back Monday ready to work. I took the folder with shaking hands and stood to leave. At the door, I paused and looked back. Brock had already returned to his computer, but something made me say, "Sir, that person you were 10 years ago, the one nobody helped? I think they would be really proud of who you became." His fingers stilled on the keyboard. For just a moment, our eyes met across the office, and I saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise, appreciation, and something else I couldn't name but felt all the way down to my bones. Go home, Levi, he said softly. And thank you. I left his office feeling like my entire world had been turned upside down and reassembled into something I didn't recognize yet. As I rode the elevator down, clutching my new assignment folder, I couldn't stop replaying our conversation. The way he'd looked at me, the things he'd said, the feeling that something significant had just begun, something neither of us had intended but both of us had felt. Monday couldn't come fast enough. The weekend passed in a blur of nervous energy and overthinking. I replayed every moment of Friday morning approximately 800 times, analyzing each word Brock had said, each look he'd given me, trying to figure out if I'd imagined the undercurrent of something more than professional courtesy. By Monday morning, I'd convinced myself I was being ridiculous. He was the CEO. I was an intern. End of story. Jennifer Hayes turned out to be everything I'd hoped for in a supervisor. Mid-30s, sharp as a knife, with a no-nonsense attitude balanced by genuine warmth. She gave me a proper tour of the 15th floor, introduced me to the team without any awkwardness about my reassignment, and laid out clear expectations for my role. Within hours, I felt more valued and respected than I had during my entire first day. Fair warning, Jennifer said as she set me up at my new desk, which actually had a working computer and functional air conditioning. Brock takes a personal interest in the people on this team. He'll drop by occasionally, sit in on meetings, check our progress. Don't let it freak you out. He's hands-on but not micromanaging. Just be yourself and do good work. I nodded, trying to ignore the way my pulse jumped at the mention of his name. Be yourself, right. I could do that. Totally normal and professional. The first week flew by in a whirlwind of actual meaningful projects. I worked on market analysis, contributed to strategy sessions, and collaborated with people who treated me like a legitimate team member instead of free labor. It was everything I dreamed my internship would be, and I threw myself into it with desperate enthusiasm, trying not to think about the fact that I owed it all to a chance encounter under a desk. But I couldn't stop thinking about Brock. I saw him occasionally, glimpses across the floor or passing in hallways, always surrounded by executives or deep in conversation. He never looked my way, never acknowledged my existence, and I told myself that was fine, that it was appropriate, that the moment in his office had been a one-time kindness and nothing more. Then came the late afternoon 2 weeks into my reassignment when everything changed again. I was alone in one of the small conference rooms, preparing materials for the next day's presentation. Most people had already left, but I'd wanted to triple-check my work, make sure every detail was perfect. I was so absorbed in my laptop screen that I didn't hear the door open. Burning the midnight oil again? I jerked around so fast I nearly knocked over my water bottle. Brock stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, jacket gone, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. My heart immediately started doing complicated gymnastics routines in my chest. Just finishing up some prep work, I managed, trying to sound normal and professional. I wanted everything ready for tomorrow. He walked into the room and closed the door behind him, which immediately made the space feel smaller and more intimate. Mind if I see what you're working on? Of course not, sir. I angled my laptop so he could view the screen, hyper aware of how close he was standing, how I could smell his cologne. Something subtle and expensive that made my head feel fuzzy. He studied my work silently for a long moment, and I held my breath, waiting for criticism or correction. Instead, he smiled. Actually smiled. This is excellent work, Levi. Jennifer was right about you. She talks about me? The question came out more surprised than I intended. She mentioned you show up early, stay late, and produce quality work consistently. That's high praise from her. He leaned against the conference table, casual in a way that felt deliberately chosen. How are you settling in? Honestly, it's been amazing, I said, and meant it. I actually feel like I'm learning real skills here, contributing to actual projects. It's everything I hoped my internship would be. Good. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed somehow, become softer. I've been meaning to check in with you personally, but I wanted to give you time to adjust without feeling like I was hovering. Corporate hierarchy and all that. There it was again. That undercurrent of something unspoken. The air between us felt charged, heavy with words neither of us was saying. I knew I should just nod and accept his explanation, but something made me brave. Is that the only reason? I asked quietly. Brock's eyes met mine, and I saw surprise flash across his face, followed by something more complicated. What do you mean? I took a breath, knowing I was probably about to make a huge mistake but unable to stop myself. Sometimes when I see you across the office, you look at me, not just a professional glance, but longer. Like you're thinking about something, and then you look away really quickly, like you caught yourself doing something you shouldn't. The silence that followed was deafening. I'd crossed a line. I'd imagined everything. I just ruined the best opportunity of my life by projecting my own confused feelings onto my CEO. But then Brock said, very quietly, you noticed that. It wasn't a question, it was an admission. My heart stopped, restarted, then began racing double time. I thought I was imagining it, I whispered. You weren't. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that seemed almost vulnerable coming from someone usually so composed. I've been trying very hard to maintain appropriate boundaries. You're an intern, I'm the CEO. There's a massive power imbalance, and any personal interest on my part would be completely inappropriate and potentially harmful to your career. Personal interest, I repeated, testing the words. Yes. He looked at me directly now, no more glancing away. Which is why I've been keeping my distance. Why I've been careful not to single you out, or give anyone reason to think you're receiving special treatment beyond your initial reassignment, which was entirely merit-based. I should have been scared. Should have been worried about implications and complications. Instead, I felt something warm unfurl in my chest. Something that felt dangerously like hope. What if I started, then stopped, gathering courage? What if I told you that I feel it too? Whatever this is, Brock closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, they held a mixture of longing and restraint. Then I would tell you that we need to be very, very careful, that nothing can happen while you're an intern under my company's roof, that the ethical complications are serious and real. But after? I asked, hardly believing I was having this conversation. After is a long time away, he said, but there was a promise in his voice. You have months left in your internship. A lot can change, or nothing might change at all, I countered softly. He smiled then, small but genuine. Or that. But either way, I meant what I said before. You're talented, Levi. Whatever does or doesn't happen between us personally, your career here is about your merit. Not about this, whatever this is. Okay, I agreed. Then, because I was apparently incapable of self-preservation, I added, but for the record, I'm glad it's not just me feeling this. It's definitely not just you, Brock said, his voice low and rough in a way that sent shivers down my spine. Which is exactly why I need to leave this room right now, before I do something that complicates both our lives. He pushed off from the table and headed for the door. With his hand on the handle, he paused and looked back at me one more time. Finish your prep work and go home at a reasonable hour. That's not a suggestion from your CEO. That's a request from someone who cares about you. Then he was gone, leaving me alone in the conference room with my racing heart and the stunning realization that Brock Wyatt, Forbes cover CEO, had just admitted he had personal interest in me. And somehow, impossibly, I had to figure out how to survive the next several months knowing that something real existed between us but couldn't be acted upon. I looked down at my laptop, at the presentation I'd been working on, and couldn't help but smile. Whatever happened next, whatever complications arose, at least now I knew. The connection wasn't one-sided. The feeling wasn't imagined. And maybe, just maybe, some rules were worth the wait before breaking. I'd planned to keep my distance after that conversation in the conference room, to bury these feelings under layers of professionalism and common sense. But fate apparently had other plans. The morning after our confession, the company announced a mandatory 3-day retreat at a mountain resort for team-building exercises, and the memo explicitly stated that all departments would attend, including interns. The bus departure was scheduled for Friday morning. I arrived early, claimed a window seat near the back, and immediately plugged in my headphones, hoping to create a barrier between myself and the world. I was scrolling through my phone, pretending to be absorbed in nothing, when someone dropped a bag onto the seat beside me. I looked up and nearly swallowed my tongue. Brock stood there in jeans and a black sweater, looking nothing like the suited executive I'd grown accustomed to seeing. This version of him was somehow more dangerous, more real, more devastatingly attractive in his casual weekend clothes. The seat taken? His tone was carefully neutral, but there was something playful dancing in his gray eyes that made my stomach flip. No, sir. I managed, my voice coming out slightly strangled. He settled into the seat, close enough that I could catch the scent of his cologne, something woody and sophisticated that made my head swim. The bus filled up around us with chattering employees excited for a break from the office routine, but I was hyper-aware of every inch of space between us, which wasn't much. The ride to the mountains took 3 hours. We barely spoke, both maintaining the pretense of professional distance, but every time the bus hit a bump or turned a corner, our arms would brush against each other. Each accidental touch sent electricity racing across my skin, a sweet torture that left me feeling wound tight as a spring. I caught him glancing at me twice, and both times we quickly looked away, like teenagers caught staring. When we finally arrived, the resort took my breath away. Towering pine trees surrounded the property, a crystal-clear lake stretched out behind the main lodge, and cozy cabins dotted the hillside like something out of a fairy tale. It was beautiful and remote, and absolutely the worst possible place to be when you're trying not to fall harder for your boss. The retreat coordinator began announcing room assignments, reading names off a clipboard. I heard my name called and waited for my roommate assignment, already dreading 3 days of awkward small talk with a stranger. Levi Carter and Brock Wyatt, Cabin 7. My heart plummeted straight into my shoes. This had to be a mistake. HR wouldn't possibly room an intern with the CEO. But when I looked at Brock, he seemed equally surprised. Though he recovered quickly, his expression smoothing into professional acceptance. "Guess we're bunkmates," he said casually as we collected our keys and headed up the path. "Hope I don't snore." Cabin 7 was charming and intimate, with 2 beds separated by maybe 4 feet, a small bathroom and a window overlooking the lake. The space felt impossibly small with Brock in it, his presence filling every corner until I could barely breathe. That first night was excruciating. We moved around each other carefully, hyper-aware of every movement, every sound. I took the bed by the window, he took the one by the door, and we both pretended this was completely normal and not at all complicated. When the lights went off and darkness filled the cabin, I lay rigid under my covers, listening to him breathe on the other side of the room. His breathing was steady and calm, while mine was erratic and shallow. "Levi?" His voice cut through the darkness after what felt like hours of tense silence. "You asleep?" "No," I whispered back. "Can't seem to settle down." A pause then. "Me neither." The admission hung between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I gathered every ounce of courage I possessed and asked the question that had been eating at me since we got our room assignment. "Brock, what are we doing? The situation we're in, I mean." I heard him shift in his bed, the sheets rustling. When he spoke, his voice was rough and honest in a way that made my chest ache. "I don't have a good answer for that, but I'm not going to lie to you, Levi. From the moment I found you under my desk, I haven't been able to get you out of my head, even when I know I should." My heart hammered against my ribs. "This is wrong though. You're literally my boss." "I know." Frustration leaked into his tone. "Believe me, I know. But feelings don't exactly follow the employee handbook, do they?" I stayed silent because what could I say? He was right. My feelings certainly hadn't consulted any handbook before deciding to crash into my life and complicate everything. "For what it's worth," Brock continued softly, "I never planned this. I've been in business for 10 years and never once looked at an employee as anything other than an employee. Then you showed up, exhausted and apologetic and so damn genuine. And everything I thought I knew about boundaries went straight out the window. So what do we do?" I asked, barely breathing. "We survive these 3 days without doing anything stupid. We go back to the office and maintain professionalism. And we see if these feelings fade or if they're real enough to wait for." He paused. "Think you can manage that?" "I can try," I whispered, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "Good. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow's gonna be exhausting apparently." But sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, listening to Brock eventually drift off while my mind raced through every possible outcome of this impossible situation. By the time dawn filtered through the window, painting the cabin in shades of gold and amber, I'd come to one undeniable conclusion. I was in way over my head, and there was absolutely no safe way out. I watched the sunrise through the window, Brock's steady breathing a constant reminder that he was right there, so close and yet impossibly far away. 3 days suddenly felt like both an eternity and not nearly enough time. When he finally stirred awake, stretching with a soft groan that did absolutely nothing helpful to my already chaotic thoughts, our eyes met across the small cabin. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," I managed back. And just like that, day 1 of the retreat began, with all its complications and unspoken promises hanging between us like a storm about to break. Day 2 of the retreat brought a packed schedule of team-building activities designed to foster collaboration and trust. Rock climbing walls, trust falls, obstacle courses, and group problem-solving challenges filled the itinerary. I'd hoped the activities would provide enough distraction to keep my mind off Brock and our situation, but somehow, impossibly, we kept ending up as partners. The first time could have been coincidence. The second time felt suspicious. By the third activity, I was convinced someone in HR had a twisted sense of humor or the universe was actively working against my self-control. The rock climbing wall loomed 30 feet high, intimidating and thrilling. I'd never climbed before, but I wasn't about to look weak in front of the entire company. Brock was assigned as my belayer, which meant he'd literally hold my safety rope while I climbed. The metaphor wasn't lost on either of us. "Just focus on the next handhold," he instructed as I approached the wall. his hands already gripping the rope with practiced confidence. Don't look down, and remember I've got you. I started climbing, finding my rhythm in the movement, the physical challenge a welcome outlet for all the tension coiled inside me. Halfway up, my foot slipped on a wet hold, and for one terrifying second I hung in empty air, panic flooding my system. You're secure. Brock's voice cut through my fear, steady and absolutely certain. I won't let you fall, Levi. Find your footing and keep going. Something about the conviction in his voice steadied me. I found the next hold, then the next, climbing until I reached the top and rang the bell with shaking hands. When I rappelled down and my feet hit solid ground, Brock was there with the most genuinely proud smile I'd ever seen on his face. The warmth that spread through my chest had nothing to do with the physical accomplishment and everything to do with that look in his eyes. Well done, he said quietly, for my ears only. You trusted me. Yeah, I breathed. I did. That evening, they organized a bonfire by the lake. People gathered in clusters, roasting marshmallows and singing camp songs with varying degrees of enthusiasm and musical talent. I found myself drifting away from the crowd, needing space to think, to breathe, to process everything that had happened. The stars above were incredible this far from the city. Millions of pinpricks of light scattered across the velvet darkness. I was so absorbed in the sky that I didn't hear Brock approach until he settled onto the log beside me, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. Escaping the festivities? His tone was teasing, lighter than it had been in the cabin. I smiled despite myself. Just needed a minute to decompress. It's been an intense day. He nodded, and for a while we just sat together, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant laughter of our colleagues. The silence between us felt different now, charged with possibility rather than awkwardness. About what I said last night, Brock began, his voice dropping lower. I meant every word. I turned to look at him. The firelight cast flickering shadows across his features, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw, the intensity in his eyes as they fixed on mine. I know you did. So tell me what you're thinking. Really thinking, not what you think you should say. I took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. I think this is the most complicated thing I've ever experienced. I think I should be terrified about what this could mean for my career, my reputation, everything I've worked for, and I am scared. But, I paused, searching for the right words. But I also keep thinking about how I feel when you look at me, how safe I felt on that wall, knowing you had my rope, how right this feels even though logic says it's all wrong. Brock reached out slowly, deliberately, and took my hand in his, hidden from view by the angle of our bodies and the darkness. His palm was warm, his grip firm but gentle. We can take this slowly. No pressure, no rush, no expectations beyond what we both want. Just please don't ask me to stop caring about you, because I don't think I'm capable of that anymore. The vulnerability in his admission made my throat tight. I'm not asking that. Good. His thumb traced small circles on the back of my hand, a touch so simple it shouldn't have made my entire body light up, but it did. Then we figure this out together, one day at a time. We sat there for another hour, hands clasped in the darkness, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about growing up in a small town in Oregon, about his first failed startup at 22, about the mentor who'd taught him that success meant nothing if you lost yourself achieving it. I told him about my childhood dreams of changing the world through business, about my parents' sacrificed retirement savings to send me to college, about the pressure I felt to prove their faith in me wasn't misplaced. By the time we walked back to the cabin, something fundamental had shifted between us. The walls we'd carefully maintained had crumbled just enough to let something real through. When we climbed into our separate beds that night, the darkness felt less heavy, the space between us less impossible to cross. Levi? Brock's voice drifted across the cabin. Yeah? Thank you for being honest with me tonight, for trusting me with the real you. I smiled into my pillow. Thank you for being someone worth trusting. Sleep came easier that night, wrapped in the knowledge that whatever complicated mess we were navigating, at least we were navigating it together. And somewhere in the space between waking and dreaming, I realized I wasn't just falling for Brock Wyatt. I was already gone, tumbling head over heels with no safety net except his promise to catch me if I fell. The fire outside had burned down to embers by the time exhaustion finally claimed me, but the warmth in my chest burned steady and bright, fueled by stolen glances and whispered confessions and the feeling of his hand in mine. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own moments of tension and restraint. But tonight, in this cabin in the mountains far from the office and its rules, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, some rules were worth bending. The final day of the retreat dawned clear and crisp, the kind of perfect mountain morning that belonged in travel brochures. The schedule listed a challenging hike up the ridge trail. Optional but strongly encouraged. Most people groaned about the early start time, but I was eager for it. Physical exertion meant less time trapped in my own spiraling thoughts about what would happen when we returned to reality. I was adjusting my backpack straps when Brock appeared beside me, already dressed in hiking gear that somehow made him look like he belonged on an outdoor adventure magazine cover. "Planning to tackle the ridge?" he asked, falling into step beside me as we joined the group heading for the trailhead. "Figured I'd give it a shot. You? Wouldn't miss it." There was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't just talking about the hike. The trail started easy but quickly grew steep and demanding. Within the first mile, several people turned back, choosing to spend their last morning at the lodge instead. But I kept climbing, driven by stubborn determination and the awareness of Brock hiking just behind me, close enough that I could hear his breathing, feel his presence like a constant warmth at my back. 2 hours into the climb, we reached the summit. The view stole whatever breath I had left. Clouds drifted below us in wispy formations. The mountains rolled away in every direction like frozen waves, and the morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber that looked almost unreal. "Worth the climb?" Brock asked, coming to stand beside me at the edge. "Absolutely," I breathed, unable to look away from the panorama. "I agree." But when I glanced over, he wasn't looking at the view. He was looking at me. My heart stuttered. We were mostly alone up here, just a handful of other hikers spread out across the summit, none paying attention to us. The isolation felt both dangerous and perfect, a stolen moment outside the normal world and all its complications. "Brock," I started, not sure what I wanted to say. He moved closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, close enough that if I leaned forward just a fraction we'd be crossing a line we couldn't uncross. His hand lifted slightly and I thought he might touch my face, might close that final distance. Then voices echoed up the trail announcing the arrival of more hikers. Brock immediately stepped back, his professional mask sliding into place so smoothly it was like the moment had never happened. But it had. We both knew it had. The almost kiss hung between us like a promise or a warning. I couldn't tell which. The descent was quieter, more contemplative. My legs burned and my lungs ached, but my mind was entirely focused on what had almost happened on that summit. What would have happened if we hadn't been interrupted? Whether I wanted it to happen or whether I was relieved it hadn't. By the time we reached the bottom, I still didn't have answers. The bus ride back to the city that afternoon carried a different energy than the ride up. Everyone was exhausted, sunburned, and ready for their own beds. I claimed another window seat, and this time when Brock sat beside me, it felt inevitable rather than surprising. 20 minutes into the drive, exhaustion hit me like a physical weight. My eyelids grew heavy, my head started to nod forward. I tried to fight it, tried to stay alert and appropriate, but my body had other plans. The next thing I knew, I was waking up with my head resting on something warm and solid. It took my sleep-foggy brain a moment to realize I'd fallen asleep against Brock's shoulder. I jerked upright, mortified, but his hand caught my arm gently. "It's fine," he murmured, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. "You needed the rest." I didn't mean to. I know, but I didn't mind. His eyes held mine for a long moment before he released my arm. "Get some more sleep. We still have an hour left." This time when I let my head rest against his shoulder, there was a choice rather than an accident. His breathing was steady beneath my ear, his warmth seeping into my tired muscles. And I let myself have this one small comfort. Just this once. Just for now. Monday morning arrived too quickly. Back in the office, everything should have returned to normal. But the retreat had changed something fundamental between Brock and me. Had cracked open a door we both knew we shouldn't walk through but couldn't quite bring ourselves to close. 3 days later, He called me to his office to review some documents. It was a legitimate work request, nothing unusual, but my pulse still raced as I took the elevator to his floor. When I entered his office, the space felt different than it had that first morning weeks ago. Now it was familiar territory, filled with memories both professional and decidedly not. "Have a seat," Brock said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. He slid several papers toward me. "Just need your signature on these project agreements." I took the pen he offered, and our fingers brushed in the exchange. It was barely contact, the kind of accidental touch that happened dozens of times a day between people in offices everywhere. Except this time, neither of us pulled away. His fingers lingered against mine, warm and deliberate, while his eyes searched my face. "Levi." My name and his voice sounded like a question and an answer all at once. "I need you to understand something." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I'm willing to wait, however long it takes, whatever we need to figure out to make this work properly. But I can't pretend you're just another employee anymore. I can't act like these past weeks haven't changed everything." His grip on the pen tightened, keeping our hands connected. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" "I think so," I whispered, my throat tight with emotion. "I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I'm not pressuring you for answers you might not have. I'm just telling you that when you're ready, whenever that is, I'll be here. And whatever we build together, we'll build it right. No secrets, no shortcuts, no compromising your career or reputation." What if I said I'm already ready? The words escaped before I could stop them. What if waiting feels like the hardest thing I've ever done? Brock's eyes darkened with something that looked like hope and restraint mixed together. "Then I'd say we need to be smart about this. Strategic. Your internship ends in 3 months. After that, the power dynamic changes. The ethical concerns shift. We can handle 3 months, can't we?" I nodded slowly. 3 months suddenly felt both impossibly long and mercifully short. "We can handle it." "Good." He finally released the pen, but the promise in his eyes remained. "Now sign these papers before someone comes looking for you." I signed, my hand only shaking slightly, and stood to leave. At the door I paused and looked back. Brock was watching me with an expression that made my heart ache with want and patience in equal measure. 3 months, I said softly. 3 months, he confirmed. "I can wait that long for something real." As I walked back to my desk, I realized I'd just committed to the longest 90 days of my life. But for what waited on the other side, for the possibility of something genuine and lasting, with someone who saw me as more than just an intern or an employee, I'd wait. We'd both wait. And somehow knowing we were waiting together made all the difference.